What a view! The Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Dome of the Rock, the old city of Jerusalem, a key focus for three great religions. The Israelis captured it in 1967, and because of its symbolic value as the old capital of Kings David and Solomon, incorporated it into their modern capital. That caused the continuing anger and enmity of the Arabs. After the death of Solomon, the Bible says, Israel divided into two kingdoms. But the time when David took over Jerusalem and Solomon built the temple, the 10th century, is called the United Monarchy, when Jerusalem was the glorious capital of all Israel. Solomon's temple is long gone, but was never to be forgotten. It stood on the mountain where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. Many faiths hold Jerusalem sacred. Now, some scholars say that Solomon never existed, and that Jerusalem was never the capital of the Kingdom of Israel.
We really don't have archaeological evidence for a united monarchy under David and Solomon in the way that it's depicted in the Bible.
There's almost no evidence for the 10th century. There's almost no evidence for Solomon. So Jerusalem was probably a very poor village or a very small town.
If you look at all the excavations that have gone on in Jerusalem for over 100 years, a very heavily excavated site, you can barely find a handful or two of sherds that you can date to the 10th century, that is, to the so-called Solomonic period. Based on this evidence, it seems like there wasn't a city here. However, to speak about evidence, the absence of evidence, as proof is ridiculous. There are current excavations in Jerusalem, and I don't think I'm misquoting the excavator if I say that in all of his excavations, he has never found, even in his dumps, digging down from the top to the bottom, he has never found one Byzantine sherd. Now we know that Jerusalem was a big city in the Byzantine period. Because he has not found any Byzantine evidence in his excavation, does that mean there wasn't a Byzantine city?
Obviously not. But then there's a Byzantine mosaic map of the city about 40 miles away. The problem with David's Jerusalem is that there is no reference to it anywhere at all outside the Bible. There is only one single reference to the Israelites known in Egypt. It's a record of how the pharaoh Merneptah crushed all opposition in other lands. It's generally dated about 1200 BC, around the time when the Israelites should have been conquering Canaan.
The people of Israel are laid waste. They are childless. Palestine has become a widow for Egypt.
If we had no Bible, we would assume that Merneptah had attacked some odd folk in Canaan called the people of Israel, worshippers of El, who was the Canaanites' chief god, and wiped them out. And we don't find the word Israel mentioned anywhere for the next 350 years. The story in the Bible is totally different, of course. Instead of saying that the Israelites were destroyed by Pharaoh, the Bible says that they took over the land and created a great kingdom ruled by King David from Jerusalem. If you go looking for David in Jerusalem, you find a lot. He's everywhere. This is his city, the city of David, Zion. It gave its name to Zionism, the political movement that created modern Israel. The city of David is a ridge of mountain some 200 yards by 600. This part of Jerusalem was under Arab rule until 1967. Today there's a Zionist settlement here.
We're standing on the actual grounds where the palace of King David once stood. Essentially, the city of Jerusalem during the biblical period of time was a teeny little mountain, circled by massive mountains all around it, stretching south of here, with right above us in the north is Temple Mount, where the Holy Temple once stood.
I mean, is there a political element to actually being here in this important site, obviously for Jews and the history of Israel, but it's also taking land away from the Arabs? I mean, are you protecting in some way Temple Mount?
Well, I would say yes. You need to understand that the fact that Temple Mount stands here and that this is the corridor of access to Temple Mount plays a major significance in terms of the future plans of some kind of a political settlement here. But the greater emphasis is more of the historical, archaeological importance of life here.
The archaeology and the politics go together. These Jewish settlers are funding excavation by the Israeli Department of Antiquities into the ground under their feet, looking for the proof that David and Solomon ruled Israel from Mount Zion.
Why is it important that you should plan whenever you can afford to, or whatever it suits, to dig down, to find the palace?
I could comfortably look down at the city and see the boundaries of the city of Jerusalem from the perspective of King David. I could imagine him sitting in his palace writing the book of Psalm, understanding the passages that he's describing. But there's so much that we don't understand in terms of how the city functioned and how the people lived here, that every time we put a shovel in the ground here and lift it up, more evidence come forth, more passages of the Bible come to life.
Perhaps this 8th century BC toilet seat illustrates the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 27. Look it up later. It was in a house built into this much older, massive structure, presumably the fortress referred to in the Bible.
David took the fortress of Zion. David dwelt in the fortress and called it the city of David. And David built round about.
The fortress seems to date from about 200 years before David, so it was there at the time, and there were a few fragments of pottery from his day found in the structure, but no trace of David's city. The only new buildings discovered were from the 8th century, 200 years after David. The settlers are waiting for the new excavations to supplement these fragments with positive evidence of the Israelites in Jerusalem in the 10th century.
Well, you see, we are now outside the city of David. The city of David is there. We are just at the city wall, outside, and we cannot climb into it. The question is only, in what period of time is this city wall protecting the city of David?
So could this be built by David or Solomon, or there were...
Well, it cannot, because our excavation on the top of the wall and behind the wall, inside the city, produced only pottery from a couple of centuries after David and Solomon, from the 8th century BC.
Right.
That's the problem throughout the city. The Bible says that around 1000 BC, King David captured Jerusalem. According to the book of Samuel, his troops got in through a gutter or water pipe.
This is amazing, Ronnie. What is this place?
We are underground in a tunnel cut by men. We are now going to the spring to draw water. Secretly, this was cut by men in the 18th century BC by the Canaanites.
So this was approximately 800 years here already, before the time supposedly that King David conquered the city.
Yes. If we go by the pottery, and this is our only way to know, then we don't have not a single sherd near the spring, and in the vicinity, close vicinity of the spring, we don't have a single sherd until now in the excavation dating to the 10th century BC. So that is the days of David. We don't have.
Right.
So we have here a confrontation between text and archaeological finds.
The Jewish settlers who are sponsoring your work here, Ronnie, you haven't really found the city of David for them. How pleased are they with your work?
Well, we didn't look for them for a city of David or for the footprints of King David. We are excavating whatever is here. I know that we have a problem. I mean, we is the archaeologists and the Bible scholars have a problem on the presence of Israelites. We have only from the Canaanites of the 18th century, and we have of the Israelite of the 8th century, a millennium later, but in between we don't have. Nobody has broken in the 10th century a bucket or a cooking jar or anything made of pottery, which is very difficult to accept because people in ancient times broke pottery in huge quantities, and if we don't have the 10th century, then it means that nobody in the 10th century was near the spring.
This is bewildering. The Christian story says that Jesus was a descendant of David. This is the city where David and Solomon ruled 3,000 years ago. No trace of an Israelite presence? No David? No holy city?
in memory of Major General Shlomo Goren, first Chief Rabbi of the Israel Defense Forces and Chief Rabbi of Israel, leader of the liberators of the Temple Mount and Western Wall. The story of the ancient Israelites conquering the land as the chosen people of the only God may not be true. But when the Israelis conquered Jerusalem in 1967 in the name of that story, soldiers who'd never shown any interest in their religion before broke down and wept as they reached the Western Wall.
This is a symbolic site, but some scholars insist that there was no Judaic city here until the 9th century BC, when it was in Judah. It was not in Israel at all. When they say that, it has real political significance, whether they know it or not.
If we concentrate on the question of when it became the capital of Israel, it never was.
So really, Jerusalem first became the capital of a state called Israel in 1967. Is that fair enough to say?
Oh.
So do you see what I mean?
Yes, this is the first time that the older city of Jerusalem becomes associated with a state called Israel.
That kind of statement is, not surprisingly, seen as very dangerous by Zionists.
I don't think that they are actually trying to threaten the existence of the state. They are supplying armament and ammunition to those who want to delegitimize the Israeli state. Archaeology is a big puzzle, and if you say that I haven't found this stone and this stone and this stone, there is still enough left of it to put the picture together.
Archaeologists often say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because they can't find evidence of King David's capital at Jerusalem doesn't mean it wasn't there. Perhaps it's a general problem. Perhaps it's hard to find evidence of anyone from this distant time. So I checked. David's people are missing. What about Goliath's? A few years after Pharaoh Menaptah said he had wiped out the Israelites, his successor, Ramesses III, had to deal with a massive invasion of people from the sea. Among them were the Philistines. They ended up settling on the Canaanite coast. Larry Steger is digging at one of them, Ashkelon. And oddly, he has not had the same problem. We're looking for Philistines? Here they are.
We're right down on the coast, and here it's a completely different world. This is a cosmopolitan world, whereas they're a village, agrarian kind of world. We have new elements that have never been seen before.
If you went entirely by the finds, you would have to say that in the days of the United Monarchy, Jerusalem was nothing much at all, but Ashkelon was a thriving city.
The Philistines were actually related to the Greeks. We have painted pottery that goes back to Greek Mycenaean prototypes. We also find in Cyprus and here, and some parts of the Greek world, scapula, the shoulder blade of a cow that's been incised. And maybe you'll have 20 or 40 incisions on it, and it will be used as a musical instrument. Again, that's something that we find among the Philistines, but not in the surrounding cultures.
This discovery that the Philistines come out of the world of the ancient Greeks, the world described by Homer, makes sense of some things in the Bible that had seemed baffling.
If you look at the story of Goliath and David, David, of course, is not dressed in armor, doesn't have a helmet, Goliath does. We know that the Canaanites and the Israelites didn't have helmets, but the Greeks did. Goliath is essentially a Mycenaean warrior, and he wears something that a Canaanite or an Israelite would never wear. He has shin guards or greaves, and so these are in metal.
Does that sound true? Would he have appeared like that?
We have the warrior vase from Mycenae, and those warriors wear the helmets and they have shin guards. So there's no way that someone could come up with as many accurate ideas about them as we have in the Bible and not have had some sources that were reliable. We actually learned one thing from these excavations that we hadn't thought before. Most people had the idea that the Philistines, as we use the term today, were rather loutish, boorish people.
Yeah.
We're finding that they're quite sophisticated urbanites
Right.
with a cosmopolitan culture. And in the distance is a large chalk basin,
Oh, yes,
which was used as a bathtub. Now, bathtubs are known from the Mycenaean world, from Cyprus, but never from this area until the Philistines arrived.
Thinking of the biblical figure of Goliath, he's an absolute giant. This bathtub that you found this season doesn't look too big. Can I just see what it's like for size?
Sure,
Get a sense of it. Because I'm a small fella, so I don't really reckon that.
Well,
Mind you,
it
would be all right.
Not bad.
Not bad. Rather more sort of for a figure like David, who's meant to be a little guy.
I think more like Delilah.
I'm getting rather impressed with these Philistine people, you know. Sitting out in the sun having a bath, you're perfect. It's certainly a beautiful location for having an archaeological lesson, Larry. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Now we can fill the tub now.
Time to go, I think. Thank you.
We may know nothing of life in 10th century Jerusalem, but there's so much Philistine evidence, we can even try their cooking.
Well, you see, John, this cooking pot, Philistine cooking pot, we actually call it cooking jug because it has one handle and you can pour whatever in it out. It has a flat bottom, what we call a ring base.
Right.
This is very different from the Canaanite cooking pot. You see, John, this is a Canaanite cooking pot.
Sure,
of course, it is reconstructed from all these little pieces that have been found at the site. But the end result is a typical cooking pot of this period, the period of the Philistines. And you can see that it has a very open mouth.
Completely different from the Philistine one.
Round bottom.
Well, can we give it a go? See if we can work out how the Philistines did cook a meal in the pot.
Let's try.
No, to be honest, I'm not sure we're going to want to try it, but we'll see. Right. It's very, very hot.
You see, the pot is put into the fire is very different from the Canaanite way because it's buried within the ashes. Such jugs that we saw before were never been used here in Israel before the Philistines came here.
If only there was some such distinctive evidence of Israelites at Jerusalem, or indeed anywhere.
Well, something's been happening. It's bubbling in there, but it looks rather ominously green. Do you want to just... Is that too hot to handle?
Not terribly so.
Oh, it looks...
And
if you just hold it.
yes. Do you want some of the meat?
Should we just try the soup first to see how we're getting on? Do you want the privilege? The honour? After all, it's your archaeology.
Yes.
I'm not being a coward, honestly. It'll probably need quite a bit of salt, I think.
You should try it. It's a
good?
delicious soup.
It is.
The more detail is discovered about the Philistines, the more accurate the Old Testament seems about them. It even names the Philistine site where we are cooking, Ekron, and the name was found on an inscription here. But the Bible describes Philistines as always being in the region, when in fact they were new invaders. Around 1200 BC, the time of the Trojan War, the whole of the eastern Mediterranean was in chaos. Whole peoples were on the move, and the Egyptians found themselves under attack from people from the sea. The Philistine settlement on the coast of Canaan was part of this invasion. Up to then, Ashkelon had been a Canaanite city.
Somewhere between 1200 and 1150, these Philistines moved in. But it's a new culture that's imposed on the old one. Sometimes they actually burnt down these earlier Canaanite cities.
Right.
In fact, many scholars have suggested that the Israelites were Canaanite refugees, pastoralists, sheep and goat herders, farming in the hills because of the upheaval on the lush plains.
Now, in the big change, in the collapse, there is no doubt that there were economic difficulties that forced the pastoral groups to settle down and produce their own grain. So I see the rise of early Israel as part of the bigger picture of the events that took place in the Eastern Mediterranean.
This argument is based on what is found in the simple hill country settlements that seem to be the earliest Israelite sites. The pottery in Israelite houses is Canaanite. The The cooking pots in their distinctive four-roomed houses are wide-mouthed and round-bottomed, designed for Canaanite cookery. But in Jerusalem, all this is missing. There really isn't any evidence that anyone was cooking anything there in the 10th century, which led some scholars to begin arguing that large parts of the Israelite story were entirely mythical, including the very existence of King David. Until 1993, when veteran Israeli archaeologist Avraham Baran was excavating Tel Dan, the old city of Dan in the far north of Israel.
Our surveyor was mapping the walls that are here. I mean, you have to have maps before you finish. And as we were walking by here, suddenly she yells and says, "I think we have an inscription."
My word.
So I walked over and I looked down, and yes, indeed.
And this is it.
The rays of the sun were illuminating this basalt stone, and the letters were clear, and I said, "You see the word Melech, king."
Yeah.
And Melech, Beit David, king of the house of David. See, in the first place, one doesn't find inscriptions. In the second place, one doesn't find an inscription with the name David on it. And here you have an inscription written about 100 years after David's time. Well, I tell you, there are biblical scholars who maintain that there was no united monarchy. There was no David, no Solomon. This discovery upset all their theories. And they had to argue with that discovery. Somebody went as far as saying this was a fake.
Most scholars now accept there really was a King David after all. But king of what exactly? The challenge to biblical history remains.
I think if David had been an important king, he would have turned up somewhere in contemporary historical documents. Assyrian texts, texts from Anatolia, I mean, wherever, Egyptian texts. If he was such a big figure, he would surely have turned up.
And his successor, Solomon, should have been an even bigger figure. So now I'm going looking for Solomon. It's not easy, because wherever you look for him, you seem to find someone else.